The handsome man you see here wearing red stockings and a tremendously comfortable suit of armor with a sash to match the stockings is Hernan Cortes. He is undeniably the man that conquered the Aztecs and fundamentally altered the history of the American continent, perhaps almost as much as Columbus did. Obviously, Hernan Cortes's route and successes in the highlands of Mexico would not have happened without Columbus. This map shows you in white the distances that Hernan Cortes traveled across what is now Mexico, and how quickly he did it when you consider that he was doing it on foot or on horse. Within 7 years, Hernan Cortes and his men had pretty much covered the most inhabited and most important, for that matter, parts of what will become the Viceroyalty of New Spain. The green part that you see on this map was the area that was dominated by the Aztec Empire. And so if you look at the regions, the areas that Hernan Cortes and his men covered, you'll see that half of the area that he covered was controlled by the Aztecs. So that gives you a sense of why it was so important that Hernan Cortes conquer the Aztecs if he was going to effectively claim this territory for the crown of Spain. This is a map of the long and winding road that Hernan Cortes and his handful, well, not handful, but perhaps 200 to 300 men traveled on their way to what is now Mexico City, what was then Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire. Now, if you look at this long, slow march, part of it is determined by topography, right? It's not, there are mountains there that need to be either climbed over or walked around. But what Cortes is also doing is introducing himself to a series of people who will ultimately be essential in his conquest and his success at winning over, or at least just winning, the Aztecs. Tenochtitlan, here, built on a lake. This is a view, well, it's not a view, it's a drawing based on reports by people who saw Tenochtitlan as they arrived in 1519 over the Sierra that surrounds Mexico City. The reports went back to Europe, and Albrecht Dürer never saw this. He drew this based on the reports that this was a city built on a lake surrounded by mountains. And this is essentially what you see. You see the square city, the roads over the lake that lead to it, and the towns on the outskirts of the city and at the outskirts of those mountains that constitute part of the Aztec Empire. This is a more recent map of the valley, and perhaps also a more geographically accurate view of the map. And there you see again the city, the square in the center. So if you think about the town squares that are such a part of Latin America, if you travel to any city in Latin America, there's a town square. Well, these are not town squares that were brought necessarily. The concept of a town square is not something that the Europeans invented, because that town square existed in the city of Tenochtitlan well before the Europeans arrived. Now, what is the consequence of this encounter between these European men on horse and an empire dominated by Aztecs? The groundbreaking, earth-shattering consequences of Hernan Cortes's encounter with the Aztec Empire and ultimate victory over the Aztec Empire led to what one can generously call legends being told about this encounter, but what can also just be seen as outright lies about Spanish supremacy in the Americas and misgivings about the far-reaching consequences of this victory. What you see in front of you are 5 of the most common misunderstandings or lies about this part in history. The first one is that the Aztecs, the reason why the Aztecs were conquered by the Spaniards is because they mistook the Spaniards for gods. The images you see here are drawings of the god Quetzalcoatl, the plumed serpent, rendered in human form. And the reason why this myth that the Aztecs mistook the Spaniards for God is so rampant is because there are documents that have been used as evidence of this that can tell the story of the Aztec people and leaders receiving an omen telling them to expect the human form of the god Quetzalcoatl, that this god will come down to earth and that they need to accept him. And this god will be a fair skin, and he won't look like they do. He will be different from the Aztecs. Now, the only problem with the story, which you will see repeated on websites and even in textbooks, is that the evidence for this version of history does not exist in pre-Columbian or pre-conquest texts or images. This version of the story was written after the Spanish had conquered the Aztecs. Yes, it was written and it was drawn by indigenous friars and priests who'd been taught to write and who were part of a large-scale project to write the history of the Aztecs. But they were writing the history of the Aztecs for the Spaniards. So here we have one of the myths rendered irrelevant by the fact that the evidence that this myth, this story relies on, was written 50 years after the conquest. This is not a primary source that tells us what happened. It is a primary source that tells us the story that people wanted us to remember, a story that was completely constructed. The second myth is that before the conquest, indigenous people were these uncivilized, brutish, poor creatures. There's another nicer version of it that suggests that they were all peace-loving and kind and loving and communal. Now, here's a painting by Diego Rivera depicting Aztec society before the conquest. What you see behind are miles and miles of fields, productive fields that were in a sense sort of dredged out of the lake. You've got an image of a priest and all the accoutrements of ritualized religion and power in the back, and then labor organization, men working in the fields, agricultural crops, women making food with those crops, the various forms of style of dress and jewelry that mark not an uncivilized, brutish society, but a highly civilized, highly organized, productive society. Another element that tells us that indigenous societies prior to conquest were not uncivilized is the Andean quipu system. And this system of knotted record keeping is unbelievably sophisticated. Yes, it did not stay in usage after conquest because the system of writing turned out to be actually much more efficient, so certainly for the Spaniards. But this system of record keeping based on complicated knots, and here there's an illustration of these knots, cannot be considered uncivilized. These were the hallmarks of extremely well-organized societies. A third myth is that the Spanish conquest obliterated indigenous culture. Now, it is true that the Spanish conquest certainly limited the scope for the continuing development of indigenous culture, right? The quipu system, for example, is precisely one of the victims of the Spanish conquest. But the Spanish conquest replaced certain elements of indigenous cultures and imposed its own. And we can think about the quipu system, but we can also think about language, right? Spanish becomes the unifying language across the Americas. But it does not obliterate indigenous culture. And these two images are just examples of this, right? Sort of this is not a picture, the Vogue cover is sort of emblematic of the long reach of both her and her representation of what is Mexican, but the very creative way in which indigenous culture and Hispanic culture have melded together. And then the other picture is a picture of a Peru, taken in current day Peru, of an Incan man wearing traditional garb, but it's really not impossible that underneath all that he's also wearing jeans and a pair of Nike sneakers. Culture is not static, and it's very difficult to obliterate it entirely. And so when we think about Latin American culture is that hybrid, that combination of the Hispanic and the indigenous. The fourth myth is the myth of La Malinche, the Spanish name for Malintzin, a Tlaxcalan princess. And she's told to have betrayed her people because she helped Hernan Cortes conquer them. She was a translator for Hernan Cortes, and she became his wife and the mother of his son. And the picture you see on the right is a picture drawn in the early aftermath of the conquest, showing Malintzin next to Hernan Cortes negotiating with the Aztec empires. And you see images of presents that are part of this negotiation. Now, the only way that Malintzin could have been seen to betray her people if she had herself been Aztec, but she wasn't. She was a Tlaxcalan princess who had been a subject of Aztec power and Aztec imperial power. She was not a friend of the Aztecs. She was an enemy. And in this case, she was the perfect ally for Hernan Cortes because he helped her win over her enemies. Here's another evidence of this negotiated nature. This is a copy of a letter that Hernan Cortes himself writes to the Spanish king and queen, explaining how important the help of Aztecs themselves were to the conquerors. And so this is, on the one hand, you've got Malintzin being accused of being a traitor, but on the other hand, you've got evidence that the Aztecs themselves, once having recognized that they were powerless to win against the Spaniards, in a sense became agents of the conquest themselves. So this notion of betrayal is a very erroneous one when we're trying to understand the process of the conquest. Last but not least, all Spanish conquerors were not exceptional white men. The notion that they were exceptional is a Eurocentric tale that justifies the conquest of the continent. In fact, Francisco Pizarro couldn't even read or write, and that was much more common. They were also not white men. Spain, in the early 16th century, was just recovering from 700 years of Moorish conquest. So Spain was not a country of white men and women. It was a ethnically diverse territory. And so when Spaniards started traveling across the sea to conquer this land, or these territories that had been discovered by Columbus, it is not surprising that some of them would be of African descent. And the evidence we have here is, first in the picture on the right, a painting of this contact between indigenous people and Spaniards, which was drawn at or around the time of conquest, where you see Juan Garrido, a black conquistador, walking behind a white conqueror on a horse. And the fact that they were black conquistador doesn't mean that black conquistador and white conquistadors were equal, and I think that is amply made clear in this drawing where you see the Juan Garrido walking behind the man on the horse. The African influence in the Americas during the colonial period is also made apparent in this 18th century painting. Now, Afro-Latin Americans were both the product of the Moorish influence in Spain, so arriving early on in the conquest period, but were then also part of a small but significant number of slaves that were brought to New Spain. And here the 18th century painting identifies a Mexican cobbler who is of African descent and his indigenous wife and their son in his place of work. And you see in the painting both his place of work and the domestic sphere in which the wife labors with plates and water jugs. These are the main myths of the Spanish conquest. And you now know why they are not true.